The church smelled of lilies, floor polish, and secrets. A folded flag sat beside her urn. On the front row, her grown children sat still, staring at the woman they thought they knew. She had been quiet, elegant, always folding napkins just so, always bowing her head before meals. They had never once heard her raise her voice. And yet, after the final hymn, a man in boots walked up the aisle. An old cowboy. He removed his hat, and in his shaking hand he held a photograph, creased and faded, of their mother in a kimono, kissing a young American soldier in uniform. "I was there in 1945, he said, voice rough. "We got married in a chapel no bigger than a chicken coop. She told me never to tell, unless she couldn't anymore." The children didn't breathe, because in that moment, a woman they had buried as their quiet mother was being reborn as someone they had never met. The church stayed still after that, like it was holding its breath. No one moved, not even the pastor. The old cowboy stood there, hat clenched in his sun-spotted hands, the photograph trembling ever so slightly between his fingers. The children, 2 sons, 1 daughter, looked from him to one another, trying to piece together the man, the moment, the meaning. It was the youngest, Sarah, who finally stepped forward, her heels tapping against the polished wood like distant gunfire. "Who are you?" she asked, though the question trembled with something else. Who was she? "I'm Tom," the man said. "And your mama, Emiko. She was my wife a long time ago." Gasps were swallowed. No one dared speak louder than a whisper. Outside, a wind chime clinked on the porch, the only sound in a room full of stunned breath. The photo passed between hands like something holy and forbidden. It was yellowed at the edges, the corners curled. In it, a young Japanese woman stood beside an American soldier, tall, sunburned, with his hand on her waist. She wore a pale dress, not a kimono, and she was barefoot. She was smiling, laughing even, not the composed, quiet woman they had known, but someone younger, lighter. It didn't make sense. The eldest son, Mark, sat down slowly, as if the weight of the truth was a physical thing. "You're saying she married you? During the war?" Tom nodded once. 1945, in Texas." There was a silence that followed so deep it felt like a memory, the kind that presses behind the eyes but has no name. The mourners gave the family space, some quietly slipping away, others hovering, unsure whether to offer condolences or apologies. The children stayed rooted to the front pew, while Tom lowered himself onto the one behind, his knees cracking under the strain. "She never told us," Sarah said. Tom looked down at the floor, then back at the photo. "She asked me not to, said it was better that way. For you, for her. Said too many people already thought they knew what happened." His voice didn't carry bitterness, just reverence. And something heavier. Regret, maybe. Or restraint, worn for so long it had calcified into habit. He cleared his throat and glanced up. "But I reckon she'd want you to know now." Mark took the photo again, staring at it like it might change in his hands. "She never even mentioned Texas. We just thought she came here after the war. Met Dad later. He raised us." Tom gave a small, respectful nod. "He was a good man. Your mama wrote me once, said he was kind to her. That was enough." Sarah rubbed her hands together, slowly, like trying to warm them in cold air. "But why would she keep this a secret? Her whole life?" No one answered. But the silence seemed to hum with possibility, because it wasn't just a story of a woman marrying across battle lines. It was a story of something dangerous, something that might have cost her everything if told too soon, or to the wrong ears. A Japanese woman marrying an American soldier in the ruins of war? In 1945, in a place where her face alone might have been enough to draw suspicion, or worse, she hadn't just survived history, she had hidden inside it. Tom leaned back, his eyes going glassy for a moment. "I remember the first time I saw her," he said quietly. "Her hand was bandaged. She looked straight through me, like I wasn't even real. I think she was trying to disappear, but something in me—" He paused, voice breaking. "I couldn't let her." Sarah blinked, her throat catching. She realized she was crying, not because she was sad, not yet, but because she suddenly understood how little she had really known about the woman who raised her. The one who had folded napkins into cranes, who never went outside without gloves, who kept a box of letters in the back of her closet with names none of them recognized. "Tell us everything," she whispered. Tom looked at her with something between apology and reverence. "I will," he said, "but you might not be ready." And with that, the chapel began to feel less like a place of mourning and more like a door being slowly pushed open, not into grief, but into revelation. The air in the chapel still held his words as we drift back. Before the photo, before the silence, before the blanket of motherhood swallowed her name. In the final summer of the war, her name had been Emiko. She was 19 years old, with hair cut blunt at the shoulders and a bandage wrapped around her left palm from when the ceiling collapsed during the last bombing raid. She hadn't cried, not when her brother's name stopped appearing on the mail roster, not when the rice ration shrunk to a spoonful, not even when the nurse beside her was crushed under falling timber as they fled the collapsing ward. Crying, she'd been taught, was for people with time. Nagasaki didn't burn in one day. It starved first. Then it wilted. Then it broke. And in the days that followed, the Emperor's voice, crackling across radios, surrendering the empire in tones so soft they felt like silk cutting flesh, Emiko walked through a city of ghosts. The hospital she worked in as a translator-turned-orderly was little more than a triage tent set up beside a shattered train station. Outside, people lined up for boiled water and news that never came. Inside, she recorded names for the Red Cross, reading out birth dates in a language she was never praised for knowing. English had been her brother's idea. "Learn it," he'd told her, tucking a dictionary under her arm when she was 13. "It's the enemy's tongue. One day it'll save your life." He hadn't known how right he was. He also hadn't known he'd be vaporized while transporting wounded soldiers across the city. They had found nothing left of him, not even his dog tags. Only a folded handkerchief with his name stitched in red thread, scorched around the edges, was returned to her. She kept it tucked in her waistband every day after. When the Americans came, they brought leaflets first, promises of safety, clean food, medical care. Surrender was no longer betrayal, it was survival. And then one morning, an officer in a khaki uniform with a clipboard and a translator in tow approached her cot in the makeshift camp. "You speak English?" he asked. Her mouth was dry. "Yes," she answered. It was the first word she'd said all day. Within 24 hours, she was placed on a list, a truck, a ship. They sent her to the far side of the island first, a repurposed airfield. She slept on straw, translated medical briefings, and avoided eye contact. She never used her first name. Just interpreter. But she was alive, and in those days that felt like cheating. Until the day came that changed everything. She was called in early before sunrise to process a group of incoming American military personnel setting up a provisional holding camp. "Texas detachment," someone muttered. "Military police." She expected more orders, more soldiers, more boots that didn't wait for doors to open. But when she stepped into the clearing near the mess hall, she saw a man leaning against the back of a supply truck, chewing on a toothpick. He wore a uniform, but the shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and the sleeves were rolled. A sun-bleached hat sat crooked on his head. His skin was browned by weather, not war. When he saw her, he didn't snap to attention. He didn't shout. He just tipped his hat back slightly, like it was instinct, and said in a low drawl, "Ma'am." She froze. No one had called her anything with softness in years. He didn't stare. He didn't smirk. He just looked quiet and calm, like someone who wasn't in a hurry to win or dominate or explain himself. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, his silence or the way her pulse stuttered when their eyes met. Later, when she asked for a roll call sheet and someone pointed her toward him, he handed it to her without a word. Their fingers brushed. His hands were calloused like a farmer's. She felt the warmth even after he walked away. She didn't know his name then, only that he was not what she'd been trained to expect, and that, somehow, made him dangerous. The next morning he said it again. Same drawl, same tilt of the head, same ridiculous word that meant nothing in the textbooks she had studied. "Howdy, ma'am," he said, like it was his personal anthem. Emiko walked past him without acknowledgement, eyes fixed straight ahead, clipboard in hand. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. That was the point. She had been trained to translate, not to feel. Emotion was indulgence, attachment, weakness, and kindness, true, unsolicited kindness. That was the most dangerous thing of all. The base was a strange hybrid of war and farmland. There were still sandbags piled near the gates, but chickens wandered freely near the officers' tents. One building looked like a barn converted into a mess hall, and beside it, a tiny wooden chapel leaned slightly to one side, as if even its faith had grown weary. Barbed wire framed the outer edge, but inside the pace was quiet. Not lazy, but deliberate, like the land itself dictated the rhythm. Tom, though she still didn't know that was his name, always seemed to be somewhere near the main gate, leaning, watching, never imposing. He was the only one who didn't speak quickly. The others barked commands, threw around acronyms, chewed gum like it was ammunition. But he moved like someone who'd spent more time with cattle than commanders, slow, precise, unbothered. The third time he said, "Howdy," she paused, just long enough to make him notice. Then she kept walking. The fourth time, it rained. She had been carrying a wooden crate filled with translated documents, troop movement records, prisoner intake forms, medical requests scrawled in poor handwriting. The bottom of the crate gave out in the mud, pages spilled everywhere, and before she could even bend down, he was there beside her. He didn't say anything at first, just crouched in the muck and started gathering pages, pressing them back into order with calloused hands. "They'll court-martial me," she muttered under her breath in English, not even meaning for him to hear it. But he grinned. "I reckon I'll testify on your behalf," he said, tucking a dripping sheet into the pile. She looked at him. Really looked. His hat was soaked, his shirt plastered to his shoulders. He looked absurd, like a scarecrow that had come to life and decided to rescue paperwork. She didn't mean to smile, but she did. "Don't think that counts as sabotage," he added, flicking a muddy drop off the edge of one page. "You don't look much like the enemy to me." She blinked, then snatched the pile from his hands and stood. But that night she replayed the words. "You don't look like the enemy to me." They sat uneasily beside everything she'd been taught. Enemy, traitor, foreign. But he hadn't said it like a flirtation. He'd said it like he meant it. The next day, she passed him again. "Howdy, ma'am." She didn't stop, but this time she answered. "Still not my name," she said, eyes forward. He chuckled. "Guess I'll keep trying." It was the smallest thing. Laughter. But it cracked something. Later that week, she found a folded slip of paper tucked inside one of the blank translation forms. It read, "What's your name, if it ain't ma'am?" She didn't respond. Not then. But she didn't throw it away either. And for the first time since the surrender, her dreams that night were not of bombings or evacuations, but of someone asking for her name like it was a gift, not an interrogation. She hadn't expected it, but then again, she hadn't expected any of this, especially not from a man who still thought howdy was a greeting worth repeating. It was the beginning of something neither of them had a word for yet. But it had already begun. She didn't notice the fever until the room started tilting sideways. It began with a cough she ignored, then a tremor in her fingers as she tried to grip her pencil. By mid-afternoon, her eyes refused to focus, the ink on the page swimming like oil in water. She told herself it was nothing. Dehydration, maybe. Exhaustion. She'd survived worse. But her legs buckled as she stepped back from the desk, and she sank to the floor before she could call for help. The last thing she remembered was the cold metal of the filing cabinet pressing against her temple. When she woke, the ceiling had changed. It wasn't the canvas roof of the administration tent. It was wood, faded and flaking, the slats browned by sun and time. She blinked once. Her cheek was pressed to something soft. A blanket. Thick, warm, clean. She could smell the soap in it. Her body ached, but the fever haze had lifted slightly, and with it came the realization she was outside. The breeze was real, cool, dry. She heard the creak of a rocking chair nearby, then the soft snore of someone not trying to hide it. She turned her head. There he was, slumped in a chair, boots propped on the railing, hat tilted over his face. His shirt was rumpled, one sleeve rolled higher than the other, and in his lap sat a folded newspaper he hadn't finished reading. Her eyes dropped to the floor beside her. A metal cup, steam still curling from the top, sat near her elbow. Broth. Beside it, a spoon wrapped in a cloth napkin, like something prepared with purpose. She didn't move, didn't speak. She only watched. No one had stayed near her while she slept since the war began. Not like this, not without reason. Her fevered mind flicked through possibilities. Was she being watched? Was this a test? But the warmth of the blanket said otherwise. The way it had been tucked around her shoulders, not dropped or thrown, but placed. That wasn't procedure. That was care. He shifted slightly, letting out a deep sigh through his nose. She tensed, but he didn't open his eyes, didn't spring into speech, just adjusted his weight and settled again, like the quiet between them was natural. It confused her more than anything else. Back home, the only men who loomed this close had power, to command, to punish, to take. But he sat there like a tree growing beside her, present, but not imposing. When her hand moved to pull the blanket tighter, the motion was instinctual. The fabric rasped gently against her skin, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt covered. Not just in warmth, in safety. She didn't thank him. Couldn't. The words sat in her chest like unripe fruit. But she sipped the broth, and when it burned the tip of her tongue, she didn't flinch. The taste was strange, salty, strong, nourishing. Her stomach curled in gratitude she didn't trust. She swallowed slowly, letting the heat anchor her to the moment. The cowboy stirred again, this time tipping his hat back just enough to glance her way. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue, but when he saw her awake, He didn't speak. He just nodded once, barely a motion, then looked away. That nod unraveled something. Not pity, not flirtation, recognition. She wasn't the enemy here. She was just a sick girl on a porch in a borrowed country, drinking borrowed soup under a sky that didn't threaten to split open. When she laid back down, the cup empty, the blanket pulled high beneath her chin, she stared at the beam above her head for a long time. Maybe this wouldn't last. Maybe it was some strange kindness born from post-war guilt. But in that stillness, no orders, no shouting, no waiting for the next air raid, she allowed herself to believe, if only for a few minutes, that not everything she had been taught was true. There was no courtship, not in the traditional sense. No flowers, no letters, no parade of affection. Just the slow, steady rhythm of two people orbiting the same quiet spaces. The sorting room, the mess tent, the shaded path between the barracks and the laundry lines. Emiko didn't notice it was happening at first. One morning, Tom offered her the last boiled egg at breakfast. Another day, she found an extra pencil sharpened and placed beside her clipboard. Tiny gestures, so gentle they barely registered, until one did. He brought her coffee, not American sludge from the officer's pot, but a tin cup he'd boiled over the stove himself, darker and stronger than anything she'd tasted before. He didn't say anything when he handed it to her, just nodded once, like that was enough. She held it with both hands and sipped it slowly. He watched her for a reaction. "It's bitter," she said in careful English. He grinned. "That's how you know it's honest." From that moment, something shifted. Emiko had spent months watching American soldiers, laughing too loudly, eating too fast, writing letters home in bold loops. But Tom moved slower than the others. He listened with his whole face. When she spoke English, he leaned forward, like every word was something he could lose if he blinked. He began asking her questions, sometimes ones that had nothing to do with work. "What does your name mean? What kind of tree was outside your house? Do you miss the smell of rice fields?" She answered when she could, taught him small Japanese phrases, laughed once when he called miso soup meat water. He blushed so deeply it turned the tips of his ears red. Then came the orders. Emiko read the paper 3 times before she believed it. Repatriation. Female personnel deemed non-essential were to be returned to Japan within the month. No exceptions listed. She folded the page, stood, and walked outside like she might forget it by the time her boots hit the dirt. Tom found her behind the chicken pens, arms folded tight, eyes burning into the horizon. "You got orders," he said. She didn't reply. "Say something." "I don't want to go," she whispered. He nodded once. "Then don't. It's not a choice. It can be." He was quiet a moment. Then, without ceremony or poetry, he said, "Marry me." She blinked, laughed once, thought he was joking, but he stepped closer and held out a ring made from twisted wire, the kind used on fence posts. "This is not a joke?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Only thing in my life I ever said that wasn't," he said. The wedding was held 3 days later. The chaplain barely cleared the doorway of the makeshift chapel, which had once been a tool shed. Tom wore his cleanest uniform. Emiko wore a pale blue dress that had been sent in a Red Cross parcel, altered to fit by a nurse with a needle and prayer. There were no guests, save for 2 orderlies who served as witnesses and a rooster that wandered in halfway through. Tom didn't kiss her at the end. Not right away. He only looked at her, like he was memorizing the shape of her eyes in the dusty light. She blinked once, then stepped closer, placing her hand over his. That was enough. Outside, the air smelled of hay and gasoline. A flag flapped lazily on its pole. Somewhere nearby, a record player scratched out a jazz tune in the wrong tempo. They walked away together, hand in hand. No applause, no photos, just two people married in defiance of everything they'd been told not to want. Texas announced itself before it ever came into view. The heat pressed down like a hand on the back of Emiko's neck, heavier than anything she remembered from Japan. When the bus finally stopped, the door folded open with a hiss, and red dust drifted inside, coating her shoes before she even stepped down. Tom went first, boots hitting the ground like they belonged there. She followed more carefully, unsure of the earth beneath her feet. The ranch stretched wide and open, fenced by posts that disappeared into the horizon. There were no ruins here, no burned-out shells of houses, just sky, land, and the low sound of cattle shifting in the distance. Tom's parents stood on the porch, still as fence posts themselves. His mother clasped her hands together, her eyes fixed on Emiko's face, with an expression that held too many questions to name. His father removed his hat slowly, as if approaching a funeral instead of a homecoming. No one spoke at first. Emiko bowed out of instinct, the movement sharp and precise. Tom flinched, then gently touched her elbow, guiding her upright. "This is Emiko," he said, voice steady. "She's my wife." The word hung in the air, foreign and unmistakable. His mother nodded once, then stepped forward and hugged Emiko before she could prepare herself. The embrace was brief, stiff, but real. "Welcome," she said, as if the word alone might carry the weight of what she couldn't say. Later, neighbors would come by with pies and curiosity. Some stared too long, some smiled too hard, others asked Tom questions they never asked Emiko directly. Where was she from? Did she speak English? Was she staying long? She learned quickly which questions required answers and which required silence. The boots were Tom's idea. "You'll need 'em," he said, setting them beside the bed on the first night. They were too big, stiff with new leather, and rubbed blisters along her heels. Still, she wore them every morning, lacing them tight, refusing to complain. She walked the ranch slowly at first, adjusting to the way the ground shifted beneath her, how the dirt stained everything it touched. In Japan, the earth had been gray with ash. Here, it was red and alive. She learned to cook bacon, though the smell made her pause every time the fat hit the pan. It reminded her of the camps, of abundance that still felt undeserved. She learned to smile when people said she was exotic, a word that landed somewhere between curiosity and ownership. She learned to nod when they asked if she missed home, even though she no longer knew which place that word meant. Her English grew smoother, but something in her voice softened, as if each word carried more weight than before. At night, when the house settled and the cicadas sang outside the windows, she sat at the small desk Tom had cleared for her and wrote letters in Japanese. To her mother, to her brother, to no one at all. She wrote about the cattle, the heat, the way the sky seemed too big to trust. She folded each letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. She never sent them. Some truths felt safer sealed away. Tom noticed the silence growing around her like water rising around a stone. He never asked her to explain it. Instead, he defended her in small, quiet ways. When a man at the feed store asked if she was grateful, Tom stepped between them and said, "She's my wife." When someone joked about the war at the dinner table, Tom changed the subject without raising his voice. When she flinched at sudden noises, he placed himself close enough that she could feel his presence without being touched. She saw it all. She never named it. On Sundays, she stood beside him in church, hands folded, listening to hymns she didn't know. Sometimes she hummed along anyway, the melody finding her before the meaning did. Other times she stayed home and tended the garden, coaxing green shoots from the red soil. Watching something grow felt like an act of faith she could manage. She wore American shoes. She slept in an American house. She carried a Japanese past folded neatly inside her, like the letters she never sent. And as the months passed, she learned that belonging did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, through routine and patience, through a man who never asked her to be anything other than what she already was. Her silence deepened, but it was no longer empty. The silence became the wallpaper of their lives, always there, pressed around them, never explained. Emiko raised 3 children in that stillness, with hands that moved like a dancer's and eyes that never gave away what they had seen. The ranch grew busier. The children grew taller. Photographs lined the walls, but none showed her before America. The past, she decided, would live only in the creases of her hands, in the way she folded sheets so precisely they could have belonged in a tea house, not a ranch house. The children asked sometimes, especially the eldest. "Where are you from, Mom? What was it like during the war? Do we have family in Japan?" Emiko would smile, a gentle, practiced curve of the mouth, and say something like, "Oh, that was long ago," or, "I don't remember much anymore." Then she'd busy herself with the stove or ask about their school day, always steering the conversation away like a boat from the rocks. She made rice every Sunday, even when no one else wanted it. She served it in bowls, not plates, and garnished it with green onions from a small patch of garden she tended with quiet precision. But she never taught them Japanese, not even how to say good morning or mother. She kept the language inside her like a locked drawer, afraid that if it opened, the grief would come spilling out. There were signs, if you looked. The way she stared too long out the kitchen window some evenings, hands unmoving in the sink, water gone cold. The way she flinched at fireworks every 4th of July, even decades later. The way she kept a folded handkerchief tucked in her apron pocket, embroidered with kanji no one else could read. The cedar chest stayed at the back of her closet. Tom never asked what was inside. He never pried, never poked at the mystery she kept so tightly sealed. His love was steady, uncomplicated. He brought her coffee before dawn and saddled her horse without being asked. He listened when she spoke and stayed close when she didn't. Their marriage had been built in the cracks between 2 countries, and what held it together wasn't understanding. It was grace. Sometimes, when the children were asleep, Emiko would sit at the edge of their bed, watching them breathe. She would brush a lock of hair from a forehead or straighten a blanket, her fingers gentle but trembling. In those moments, her eyes would cloud with something ancient, something that reached across oceans and decades. But she never spoke of it. She believed, maybe wrongly, that love alone could be enough to build a new history. Years passed. The children grew, left home, married. Grandchildren came, with wide eyes and louder questions. Emiko smiled at them, softer now, but still said little. The cedar chest remained untouched. Until one autumn evening, when the house was quiet again and the porch creaked with familiar rhythm, she walked into the bedroom and opened the chest. Her fingers hovered for a moment before lifting out the photograph. It was faded, the edges curled, the image worn, but it was still them. Her and Tom, standing under the chapel made of scrap wood, her in a borrowed dress, him in a uniform 2 sizes too big. She held it to her chest, and for the first time in decades, she wept. No one saw her. She didn't want them to. This was her reckoning, private and overdue. A life lived between two worlds. A mother who had given everything except her story. A woman who had survived not by forgetting, but by folding memory into silence. And in that moment, she wasn't just a wife, or a mother, or a woman in American shoes. She was Emiko, whole, grieving, remembering. The house was quieter than it had ever been. After the funeral, the children moved slowly through each room, touching things they'd always taken for granted. A teacup, a pair of gardening gloves, the tin where she kept sewing needles and old buttons. Grief made everything sacred, even the ordinary. It was her youngest daughter who found it. A bundle of papers, tied with thin red thread, tucked into the bottom drawer of her bedroom dresser beneath layers of neatly folded scarves. The envelope was yellowed, the ink faded but steady. Dated September 1945. Addressed simply, "To my children someday." They sat on the living room floor, cross-legged like they hadn't since childhood, and unfolded the pages. Emiko's voice, clearer than it had ever sounded in life, filled the room. She wrote of the war first, of Nagasaki, of ash in the sky and the way the light never looked the same after, of losing her brother and her name in the same week, of being called girl and translator, but never Emiko, of learning to make herself small so she would not be hurt, and then learning English so she could survive. She wrote of Tom, though not by name at first, only the man who saw me before I knew I still existed. She described the first time he touched her hand without flinching, the first time he waited for her to speak without interrupting. And then came the shame. She had been warned, by superiors, by elders, by her own trembling heart, that no American could ever truly love a Japanese woman, that if she bore children, they would live between worlds, that she would be called traitor, or worse, invisible. She had believed it. Not enough to walk away from love, but enough to bury her past beneath polite smiles and Sunday rice. "I was afraid," the letter said, "that if I told you who I really was, you might hate part of yourselves." She never wanted that. Not for them. She had chosen silence, not out of regret, but protection. But now, the letter said, with her body gone and only her memory left to remain, it was time to let the silence end. "I loved your father," she wrote, "with the kind of love that makes silence feel safe. But I never stopped being the girl from Nagasaki. If you're reading this, I hope you know the truth wasn't buried. It was just waiting." They cried, all three of them, not because she had kept it from them, but because she had carried it alone, because they had never seen her whole, and now that they did, it was too late to tell her what it meant. Her son held the letter like it might fall apart in his hands. Her eldest daughter whispered, "I didn't know," over and over. The youngest, the one who found it, folded it gently and placed it in the center of the cedar chest. This time they would not close the lid. They sat in silence for a long time after. But it was not the silence they had grown up with. This one was full. With knowing, with grief, with awe. Their mother had been a woman of two countries, two names, two stories. And now, finally, they could begin to know both. If you're finding this story as powerful as we do, please like the video and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The knock came just after dusk, when the house still smelled faintly of incense from the altar and the casserole someone had left in sympathy. The children, though grown, looked at one another like children do when something solemn approaches. No one moved until the youngest stood and opened the door. There he was, the cowboy. Older now, but unmistakable. Straw hat in his hands, posture stiff with respect. He didn't say much at first, just nodded, stepped inside, and held out a bundle wrapped in worn cloth. It was her diary, Emiko's. "I translated what I could," he said, voice like dry leaves. "She wrote in both languages, switched when it hurt too much." They laid it gently on the table. No one reached for it just yet. He sat, slowly, and they sat too. What followed was not a speech nor a ceremony, just memory, passed like breath. He told them about the porch blanket, about the time she made pickled daikon from memory because she missed home, and he ate it even though it made him tear up. He spoke of the night she stayed awake in a thunderstorm, curled up in the hall, whispering her brother's name, and how she apologized the next morning, like grief had been an inconvenience. "She carried a scar," he said, looking at each of them, "not just from the war, but from not being allowed to talk about it. Not here. Not back home." They listened. No one interrupted. The eldest held a tissue in her lap, wrung through her fingers like laundry. The son leaned forward, elbows on knees, chin down. For the first time, her life began to stretch beyond their memories of her as just mother, soft-spoken, efficient, always folding towels the same way. When the cowboy finally stood, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. "She wanted y'all to have this," he said. It was a photograph, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. In it, Emiko stood outside the chapel made of scrap wood, sunlight catching the edge of her cheek. She wore a plain white gown, clearly borrowed, sleeves a little too short, and no shoes. Her hair was tied back, neat but not ceremonial, and she was smiling, not politely, not carefully, but wide, like someone who had just let go of fear. They passed it between them, gently, reverently. "I never saw her like this," the youngest whispered. "I think this is how she wanted to be remembered," the cowboy said. They cleared a space on the mantel between a faded family Bible and a vase she once brought home from a church rummage sale. The photo fit there like it had been waiting. They stood for a long while, watching it settle into its place. Her silence, they realized, had not been emptiness. It had been a shelter, built to protect them until they were strong enough to learn the truth. And now, that truth didn't just live in a letter or a diary. It lived in the way they looked at her picture, in how they saw her, not just as a mother, but as a girl who survived war, chose love, and stood barefoot in a borrowed dress, smiling into a world that didn't yet know how to hold her. And now, finally, they would learn to. But as a girl who survived war, chose love, and stood barefoot in a borrowed dress, smiling into a world that didn't yet know how to hold her. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle crackle of the record player. The old vinyl spun in slow circles, the needle dragging out a song none of them had heard in years, their father's favorite. A country tune, soft and slow, laced with something unexpected, the twang of a shamisen buried beneath steel strings. It was a sound that didn't belong together, but somehow it worked. They sat around the kitchen table, the same one their mother had folded laundry on for decades. Now that table was scattered with pages. The letter, the diary, the photograph in its new frame, a teacup she used every morning. Things once ordinary now shimmered with a strange reverence, like artifacts unearthed too late. No one spoke for a while. Grief, it turned out, had its own rhythm, quiet, then sudden. But today the silence wasn't heavy. It was sacred. The middle daughter traced a finger over the sentence in Emiko's letter. "I stayed not because I forgot who I was, but because love let me become someone new." She read it aloud, and her voice caught at the end. The son stood and walked to the window, wiping something from his cheek. They were not children anymore. They were grown, with homes of their own, children of their own, but in that moment they were Emiko's children in a different way, not just inheritors of her quiet routines or her folded towels or her reserved smile, but of her bravery, her contradiction, her choice. She never ran from anything, the eldest said finally. She just carried it better than we ever knew. They nodded. They remembered now the way she hummed while ironing, how she'd pause sometimes at the back door, eyes on the horizon like it was a memory, the way she'd make rice with breakfast on Sundays, never explaining why. She had held on to her past without passing it down, not out of shame, they now realized, but out of protection. She had wrapped her history in silence so they could grow without the weight of war pressing on their shoulders. But now they were strong enough to carry it with her. One of them placed the letter back in the envelope, not to hide it again, but to preserve it. Another set the kettle on the stove just like she used to. The soft hiss of steam rose like a whisper. On the mantel, the photo watched over them. Her smile, unburdened, luminous, seemed to fill the room. And they understood something they hadn't before. Their mother hadn't been a ghost in her own life. She had been fully here, fully present, laughing at the wrong time during movies, folding clothes into perfect rectangles, kissing their father's cheek in the hallway when she thought no one was looking. She had been a survivor, yes, but also a lover, a bridge between two worlds that had once sworn each other enemies. She had chosen to stay, not just in Texas, not just in her marriage, but in love, in hope, in rebuilding something better from the ashes. And now, because of her, her story no longer lived in the shadows. It breathed, it belonged, it endured. They raised their teacups in the quiet, not as a toast, but as a thank you. And outside, the wind rustled through the trees like a page turning. A new chapter. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a history once left untold.